Great, thanks very much. And thanks very much for the invitation to come and speak. It's no hardship to come and speak in Paris, of course, but it's been a great meeting to sort of to sit and think through. And I've been revising my presentation repeatedly over the course of the morning. It's been very exhausting. And so I hope it sort of follows on, particularly from Phil's presentation. So I'll just start my stopwatch to keep on time. So I'm a public health researcher at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Just looking at this slide, it just strikes me I should have made the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine's logo at least as big as the donut, but it's too late. It's too late to change it. So what I want to do is pick up on some of the themes which have been discussed this morning. I do research predominantly on the activities of commercial actors on health in the field of the commercial determinants of health. So I do research on the activities of the alcohol industry, food industry, some gambling industry, a bit of various others, tobacco industry, a bit of pesticides and so on. So I suppose what I want to do is sort of broaden out some of the discussion and pick up some of the threads, and particularly pick up some of the threads relating to misinformation and industry misinformation and industry manipulation of science. So some of my examples come from alcohol industry activities, but other industries are woven in as well. My voice is cracking slightly, so I hope I can make it through the next half hour. So this is my funding statement. Most of my research is mostly funded through this thing called the Spectrum Consortium, which isn't industry. It's mostly government and research council funded. So that's my statement. So what I work on are the effects of unhealthy commodity industries. Defining an unhealthy commodity industry is a challenge, as you can imagine, but one definition from colleagues at Bath University refers to unhealthy commodity industries as industries whose primary product is considered an unhealthy commodity. In other words, it causes significant health damage. And some definitions are quite narrow, and I think in the research field, if we look back over time, unhealthy commodities focus mostly on tobacco, alcohol, ultra-processed foods, maybe breast milk substitutes. But over time, there's been a growing interest in the activities of the gambling industry, palm oil industry, fossil fuel industry, automobile, mining industries, coal industries. Some of the history of analysing the activities of these industries goes back many decades, but it wasn't really captured within the umbrella of the commercial determinants of health. So WHO has produced a definition of the commercial determinants of health. Private sector activities that affect people's health positively or negatively. The private sector influences, as we've heard today, the social, physical and cultural environments through their business actions and societal engagements, through their supply chains, labour conditions, product design and packaging, research funding, lobbying, preference shaping, i.e. shaping the preferences of consumers, and other activities. And I think the WHO definition is interesting because it mentions positive aspects of private sector activities. It might be worth discussing or thinking through whether this is important to be very interested in or not, because I guess from a public health perspective, we'd be more concerned about preventing the negative effects as opposed to focusing on any potential positive effects. So anyway, it's a point to think about. The Lancet Commission, there was a Lancet Commission on the commercial determinants of health, which launched a series of papers, 3 papers in February earlier this year. And within that, there's this diagram, slightly fuzzy, which sets out the practices of commercial actors and their allies. And by their allies, I think that includes many of the groups which Phil mentioned in his presentation. So that could also include the advertising industry, the legal industry, the media, as well as the front groups, which unhealthy commodities fund. But it's quite useful because it starts to break down what are the activities which commercial actors engage in, which might affect health, might affect public health and public health science. So one of these, as we've heard, are the political practices, and that includes lobbying and other practices to secure preferential treatment in order, treatment of the industry, to prevent, shape, circumvent, or undermine public health policies, or a combination of the above, in ways that further corporate interests. So the obvious example of that is that harmful commodity industries, many other industries as well, engage in what's sometimes called policy substitution. So they engage in, for example, corporate responsibility activities, like funding charities, providing public education activities and so on, funding schools, working with local government. And the underlying intention is to prevent closer or tighter regulation of that industry. So that's a form of policy substitution. So that's a sort of political practice in which the industry appears to be behaving like a good actor, supporting charities and so on, but the underlying intention is to delay effective public health policies. So there are lots of examples of this. Their scientific practices are well documented, and that includes, as Phil said, the production and use of evidence to alter products or otherwise secure favourable outcomes for the industry. So there's many examples of the alcohol, tobacco, gambling industry, other industries funding research which helps it to maintain its position and undermine the science, dispute the evidence on its harms, and so on. Marketing practices, we've heard about two: practices to promote sales of products or services, and reputational management practices. So these are the activities of industries which shape the industry's reputation, and that includes, as I've said, funding charities and so on. So all of these practices are the ways in which industries indirectly harm public health by helping harmful industries to preserve their position in the market and postpone or prevent effective policy interventions such as regulation of marketing and so on. So they also use, harmful commodity industries also use a number of framings and arguments, which you'll have seen quite often, in order to dispute the evidence that their products are harmful, whether it's ultra-processed foods or gambling products or alcohol products. So they will say, well, it's a normal product. So the alcohol industry says, well, 80% of people drink in the UK within guideline levels, not sure what it is in France. Or the gambling industry will say, well, people do bet, but most people aren't harmed by it. It's just a normal, natural product. And I think there was a presentation this morning, I can't remember who put up a slide which showed some particular product with leafy green vegetables or something, but it was an ultra-processed food. It might have been Carlos. But presenting harmful products as normal products is a very common industry strategy. So the alcohol industry, for example, when it's challenged on the harms of alcohol consumption, will say, how can you say that? Alcohol is it's a healthy natural product. It's made of water, yeast, hops and barley, or wine is just grapes and water, basically. And these are the arguments that it uses, for example, in the alcohol industry uses in its educational materials in schools around the world. So the alcohol industry teaches young people around the world about underage drinking, but in fact what it does is it promotes the normalization of the product using these sorts of arguments. So another common argument across industries is what I've called here a responsibility framing. So the problem isn't the product, you just need to use it responsibly. So we have drink responsibly, we had smoke responsibly, gamble responsibly, etc. So responsibility framings are very common. The industry will focus on harmful use in subgroups rather than in the population. So a harmful product industry will say, it's not that our product is harmful, it's that there's a small group of people who don't use it responsibly, and are sort of addicted to it. So it's really just a small group of people we need to be concerned with, and they probably need treatment. We don't need population level interventions. And you see behavioural framings very, very commonly. So these framings they aim to set out that it's not the product, but it's your behaviour. So you see behavioural framings very commonly. So you see references to drinking behaviour, smoking behaviour, etc., etc. I have another example later. You see a focus on targeted interventions versus population level interventions. So it's only a small number of people who need targeted with quite specific interventions. What you don't want to do, industries will argue, is regulate or act at a population level, regulating marketing or regulating availability. And another common argument is problem deflation. So whenever it's challenged, any industry will say, for example, in the case of alcohol, whenever a new report is issued in the UK about alcohol harms, the alcohol industry will always start tweeting, repeatedly saying, but the problem is declining. So if a report is issued about the problems of drinking or the rise in liver disease, the alcohol industry will say, but harmful drinking is declining, which is a sort of logical fallacy. If a problem is declining, doesn't mean it's not a problem. So you get sort of logical fallacies portrayed as arguments to do nothing, in effect. Harmful commodity industries will often focus away from the product. They'll focus on, as I say, on the individual or on the peers, the individual's peers. This relates to individual drinking, for example, or gambling in young people. So the gambling industry and the alcohol industry will say, the problem isn't our product and the problem isn't our marketing. The problem is that young people encourage other young people to drink or smoke or gamble. Nothing to do with us. And parents and teachers are quite often suggested to be the problem as well. And all of this contributes to mixed messages aimed at the public. So these are examples of responsibility framing. You can maybe, you can maybe just see enjoy responsibly there. So that's an example of a mixed message. It's saying, what Tuborg would claim it's saying is that you should drink our product in such a way that it doesn't harm you. And they will point to this message as an important public health intervention, but it's utterly meaningless because predominantly what people will see is the word enjoy, which means drink it. The word responsibly means nothing because it doesn't define what responsibly means, and everyone will define responsibly in their own way. Bet responsibly. This is from an internal tobacco industry memo in the 1960s, which talked about responsible smoking in public. So the word responsible tagged to any behaviour is an absolute red flag. I think these also reflect that sort of behavioural framing. It's not the tobacco, it's your smoking. It's not the gambling products which are designed to cause addiction, but it's your betting. And it's not the alcohol which is addictive and a carcinogen, but that you have to enjoy it responsibly, whatever that means. Phil actually mentioned this earlier, that doubt is our product. The tobacco industry's idea about this was actually a very simple one, that it would fight science with science in a way, and that it would fight the evidence which was emerging from about the 1950s that smoking caused lung cancer and cardiovascular diseases by sowing doubt in the minds of the public. And it would commission research to promote uncertainty about the harms of smoking. And so the entire public sphere was turned into a sort of an area for tobacco industry deception. And the industry argued, like the fossil fuel industry did after it, that there's always two sides to every story. The tobacco industry would argue that, first of all, it would deny that smoking caused cancer, and then it would say, well, even if smoking did cause cancer, which we're not going to admit to, lots of things cause cancer. Food causes cancer, solar radiation, keeping a parrot, that was another one which the tobacco industry pointed to, drinking green tea. So the tobacco industry pointed to all these other things and said, you know, so the causes of cancer are so complex that it's impossible for scientists with your epidemiology to prove that smoking causes cancer. So, and then whenever studies were published that showed the link between smoking and cancer, they would then say, hang on, did this study control for keeping a parrot? Well, we can't trust this study because keeping a parrot is associated with lung cancer, et cetera, et cetera. So they used and misused the epidemiology. So this quote basically sets out that tactic. It's called the Doubt is Our Product memo from 1969. It's Brown and Williamson Tobacco Company. And so the key phrase is, doubt is our product since it's the best means of competing with the, quote, body of fact. The body of fact is in inverted commas because the industry obviously disputed the facts about smoking and cancer. And the other key phrase, it is also the means of establishing a controversy. So harmful commodity industries, this is one of their key strategies. And I think we often assume that that other industries learned it from the tobacco industry, but there's some evidence that the tobacco industry learned it from the alcohol industry. But they share the strategies across industries and across the food industry and so on, and continue to do so. I mean, the main underlying strategy is to create uncertainty about causation. And this is all called what's part of what's called the industry, cross-industry playbook. So I'm going to put that down because I'm accidentally slipping back and forward between slides. But yeah, so the fossil fuel industry, we know that the fossil fuel industry did this because it knew for many decades about the consumption of fossil fuels being a key driver of climate change. But it denied it and it deceived the public and policymakers. And in the case of Exxon, Exxon knew about CO2 and climate change and the relationship between the two for many decades. And it actually used that evidence, really good quality evidence from within the industry, to plan its own work, to plan its own installations and its purchases. But at the same time, it was commissioning misleading full-page advertorials about climate change impact and mitigation measures. And Jeffrey Supran and Naomi Oreskes did a really nice analysis of internal fossil fuel industry documents that showed that 80% of the internal documents acknowledged that climate change was real and human-caused, but 81% of the advertorials that they were placing in newspapers expressed doubt. We've heard about the infant formula industry, so the slides are moving on by themselves. So I'll skip on to pharma. It might be the heat. Yeah, so the malpractices of the pharmaceutical industry, I think, are very well documented. They're very well known. So I won't list them here. But there's quite a nice book called Lethal But Legal by Nick Freudenberg, who works in this field. And the title of one of the chapters sums up the approach of the pharmaceutical industry. And the chapter is titled Pharmaceutical Corporations Misrepresenting Risk, Selling Sickness, and Co-opting Doctors to Make a Profit. And part of what the pharmaceutical industry has done, as many of you will know, is disease mongering, creating new diseases, widening the diagnostic boundaries of existing illnesses for reasons of economic benefit. And a famous example of that is the opioid epidemic. So the opioid industry, which is brilliantly documented in this book by Patrick Radden Keefe, Empire of Pain, basically one of the main marketers of opioids was Purdue Pharma, which was owned by the Sackler company who made OxyContin, the painkiller. And OxyContin was a main driver of the opioid crisis, and it's caused an international epidemic of opioid addiction which has killed, I think it's something like the equivalent of 1.2 COVID pandemics every year. So the opioid epidemic is absolutely massive. But they downplayed the harms. They marketed the use of opioids for minor and less severe pain. They funded medical opinion leaders to boost sales. Unhealthy commodity industries rely very strongly on academic experts and clinicians to help them health wash their products. They funded grassroots patient organisations and campaigns, and then they blamed the patients for using the products irresponsibly. So these are some quite interesting personal responsibility quotes from Patrick Radden Keefe's book. So the first one is from a memo to the Sacklers from one of their comms consultants, which is that they should say that it's not addiction, the opioid addiction is not addiction, it's about personal responsibility. It's abuse of the opioids. And Richard Sackler, these last two quotes are from him, from the Sackler family. Some people simply have addictive personalities, they can't help themselves, and Purdue Pharma should hammer on the abusers. And that's a fairly remarkable quote at the end. I think that the abusers aren't the victims, they are the victimizers. In other words, the people that are harmed by the opioid epidemic are victimizing Purdue Pharma, which is quite a bold statement. Keeping an eye on the clock. I think, as others have said, and as from the start of the day, that sort of understanding the tobacco industry approach to all of this is actually really key. I think when we come to thinking about the strategies and the argumentation and the misuse of science and the misuse of evidence by ultra-processed food manufacturers, it's always valuable to go back and understand how the tobacco industry, the strategies that they used, not least because we know that they shared the strategies with the food industry. And if you've read the book, I can't remember the author, Michael Moss, maybe, Sugar, Fat, Salt, he describes in that book how the tobacco industry explicitly brought food industry executives in and the marketing executives and said, okay, this is how you sell a product. Whenever, I think that was when R.J. Reynolds bought Nabisco Foods, the first thing that they did was to disseminate the playbook, as it were. But one of the things, there was quite a bit of discussion this morning about causality and causal pathways and so on. And the tobacco industry argument or angle on this, I think, is very interesting because, as you know, the tobacco industry didn't just argue that smoking didn't cause lung cancer, but it developed a whole range of very sophisticated epidemiological arguments to try to back up its statements. I mentioned some of them earlier by saying that lung cancer is complex and caused by lots of other things. There was a bit of a discussion this morning, I can't remember exactly in which session, about the fact that we don't need perfect evidence in order to act. And I think that's really relevant, and the experience of the tobacco industry is very relevant here, because we didn't need perfect evidence about the association between smoking and lung cancer in order to act. And in fact, there's a lot we don't know about the mechanisms linking smoking and lung cancer. But it actually doesn't matter, because the burden, the importance of the evidence that we do have, and the amount of evidence and the value of evidence across different types of evidence, from animal evidence, prospective studies, retrospective studies, the weight of evidence is actually clear. So there are many areas, probably every area of science, in which the evidence isn't perfect. But harmful industries will always argue that the evidence needs to be perfect before we can do anything. So that's a sort of key strategy, which should also be a red flag. Anyway, so the tobacco industry knew how to use the uncertainties in the evidence in order to argue that everything's too complex, so we can't do anything. And that strategy is still used today. So this is a tobacco industry quote from British American Tobacco. These diseases, lung cancer, cardiovascular disease, are also statistically associated with many other variables such as diet, lifestyle, heredity, and stress, which I'll come back to. But the existence of a statistical association does not mean that smoking causes these diseases. And this was called the alternative causation argument. The tobacco industry used these arguments in court, and it found that these arguments were very influential with jurors whenever the tobacco industry was defended successfully in court. And there's an internal memo from a tobacco industry law firm which says a little alternative causation evidence goes a long way. So we know that these strategies about generating doubt actually work, and complaining that the evidence is too complex to allow us to do anything. So here's some examples of this. The Scotch Whisky Association: societal issues, i.e. alcohol harms, are more complex than simply having a few drinks too many or in inappropriate circumstances. Indeed, to simply blame alcohol misses the target, perhaps because to find the true cause and solution is seen as too difficult and too complex. The Food and Drink Federation: we believe obesity is a complex problem which cannot be reduced to the demonization of one ingredient, i.e. sugar. There's no simple answer to the complex problems of obesity. So you see the same playbook across industries. McDonald's: demonizing or taxing specific nutrients, i.e. fats, is not the right tool to address obesity and offers a simplistic solution to a complex problem. Ladbrokes, a gambling company basically, blah, blah, blah. Gambling-related harm is complex and simplistic approaches are not effective. Sugar-sweetened beverage industry: there's ample evidence to suggest that taxing soft drinks won't curb obesity, not least because its causes are far more complex than this simplistic approach implies. Trying to blame one set of products is misguided. So you see across these industries this use of this simple, complex argumentation, which is about disputing causality, which is legally very effective. And Purdue Pharma, in the case of opioids, has also used it. This is Kathy Sackler, one of the Sackler family. I don't think Purdue has a legal responsibility. It's a very complex set of factors, confluence of different circumstances and societal issues and regulatory gaps. I mean, it's very, very, very complex. So that's more complex than just. Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, but I'd be very convinced by that. We know that these sort of arguments to generate uncertainty work because within our group, we did a series of randomized controlled trials in which we presented the public with industry misinformation, which a bit like those statements which were intended to create uncertainty, and we compared it to accurate information. And we did this across these five topic areas. So alcohol and breast cancer. So we know that alcohol is a risk factor for breast cancer. The epidemiology is clear, but the alcohol industry has issued lots of statements and so-called information leaflets disputing this, in which it says alcohol might cause cancer, breast cancer, but cancer is also associated with your genetics, your hormone environment, being tall. This sounds very like the tobacco industry arguments. Fossil fuel industry disputing climate change, sugary drinks and obesity, alcohol and pregnancy harms. So the alcohol industry also disputes that drinking at any level is potentially a risk factor for fetal alcohol syndrome and harms in pregnancy. So it denies the evidence on that. And smoking and lung cancer. So we trialed all of these with members of the public in a big online survey. So people would either get industry misinformation or an accurate piece of information from a health organization like Cancer Research UK or the NHS website or whatever. And it's really interesting. So in every case, the trials, this is a series of trials, showed that the industry misinformation increased uncertainty in the person reading it by about 60%. And that's quite difficult to interpret, but it's something like people were 60% more likely to say that they were uncertain about the causal relationship. And they're really surprised, if you pull those in the meta-analysis, overall it's about 60%. So it's really effective. Generating uncertainty actually works. The thing that we found most surprising is that you can even do it around lung cancer and smoking. So despite the fact that the public has known, or that there's been public information out there about smoking and lung cancer, tobacco industry misinformation about cancer is still incredibly effective. So manufacturing doubt works, and it's used by all of these industries. So the confidence interval crosses 1 here just because the sample size is quite small. But in every case, we've got other unpublished trials as well, including for opioids, misinformation. It's an effective way of generating uncertainty. That's a better. I should have shown that to you first. Okay. So as I talked a bit about responsibility messaging, and so just as a quick reminder, responsibility messaging, like drink responsibly, has a focus on the individual, not the industry. It focuses on a minority of harmful users, not the majority, not the public. It's a very vague and ill-defined term, and it has a focus on problem behaviours as opposed to on the products. So when I saw this statement from Emmanuel Macron last year when he was on the campaign trail, Emmanuel Macron, he's most famous, I think, you will know him most in the audience as being Personality of the Year, voted by the La Revue du Vin. I think he might have a political role as well, I'm not sure, but he's predominantly wine industry Personality of the Year. But he said that in relation to wine and health, the main focus should be in prevention of alcohol abuse and hazardous consumption among pregnant women and young people. The aim is not to target zero alcohol, but to prevent excessive behaviour, provide better help for those who are addicted to alcohol so they can overcome their addiction. So this is the perfect example of an industry-crafted piece of responsibility messaging mixed in with misinformation. It has everything that I've spoken about earlier. It's not alcohol consumption, it's your abuse of alcohol, hazardous consumption. I mean, this is false epidemiologically, this is nonsensical as well. The alcohol industry's argument is that we shouldn't be giving information about alcohol harms to the public generally. We should focus on young people and pregnant women, which he's picked out as well. And the behavioural emphasis, he's picked that out, excessive behaviour, and addicts. So it's a sort of it's a classic piece of alcohol misinformation. One of the ways that we've, I suppose, thinking about it from a public health and epidemiological perspective, and I'll wind up very shortly after this, that we think that the way to combat misinformation is to do systematic reviews and to look at the quality of evidence very carefully and so on. But the problem is that doing systematic reviews doesn't remove bias, and it might actually have the opposite effect. And there's quite a nice study was published, was it last year or the year before, 2 years ago, on alcohol, cardiovascular disease, and alcohol industry funding. So I think in the public mind, I'm not sure what it's like in France, I can imagine, but certainly in the UK and in other countries, people think that alcohol is protective of cardiovascular disease. The evidence on this, it's not even, it's incredibly uncertain. If there is an effect, it's a very small protective effect. And the modelling that was done in the UK for the most recent version of the guidelines on alcohol consumption suggested that if there isn't a protective effect, it's at the level of about a unit a day, and it only applies to older drinkers, and maybe older drinkers. And even then, the evidence is very disputed. So there may not be any protective effect at all. And Sue Golder and Jim McCambridge at York reviewed the systematic reviews on the topic and found 60. And 14 of the 60 systematic reviews came from alcohol industry associated authorship networks. So that a really sizable bit of what we know about alcohol consumption and cardiovascular disease actually has got the alcohol industry in the background, doing the systematic reviews which researchers do. But the systematic reviews by authors who had no industry funding, they came to mixed conclusions about alcohol and cardiovascular disease. So that probably accurately reflects the evidence base. But if a systematic review had funding from the alcohol industry, it would report protective effects. So all the systematic reviews with prior industry funding reported protective effects of alcohol consumption. So it's a really interesting example. Plus this point that the group of reviews with the industry funding are much more heavily cited. So it's an interesting example of how distorted science can actually shape public perceptions and shape the field more generally. So I'll just wind up now. I think Phil talked a bit about partnerships. I think partnerships with harmful industries are often sold to us as public health researchers or public health practitioners as being useful things to do on pragmatic grounds because industry has got resources or industry has expertise. But we know that industry misuses these opportunities to lobby, to mislead the public and policymakers, as we've seen, and to promote their own narratives. And there's actually no evidence that these partnerships with industries actually work in improving public health. And there's a lot of evidence that they're harmful. So what to do about all of this? I think, as we've heard in other presentations too, it's very useful to learn the hidden history of other industries, particularly the tobacco industry, and the relations between the industries, as Phil pointed out. I think it's quite important to raise awareness about this, publicise the playbooks, do the research. Someone asked about what can you do while waiting to overthrow capitalism. I'm sort of reframing our question. But I think what we can do in the interim is to make the public aware and policymakers aware of the strategies and the sort of distorting influence that this has on policy making and on science. And the final point, pretty much I'll end on this. I think we have to challenge the erosion of our boundaries. Quite often when we talk about industry and partnerships with academia and so on, and partnerships with public health, we end up allowing our boundaries to be eroded. And we have to remember, and it seems stupid to have to point this out, but the alcohol industry, the food industry, the gambling industry and so on are not experts in public health. And they should be, the point Phil was making at the end, they should be excluded from policy making. They have no expertise in epidemiology, but somehow over time we tend to allow those boundaries to become eroded, which is problematic. And I think, and this definitely is my last slide, I think the main thing is that we need to bring these commercial influences out of the shadows. They lurk in the background. When we look at these causal chains between the exposome or whatever, there's a commercial actor in the background who is invisible. So I think we need to be better about putting those commercial actors into the causal chains. My colleague Nathan Manny did a review of social determinants frameworks a couple of years ago. Social determinants frameworks around the social determinants of health drive how we do research, drive how we understood inequalities. But he looked through 48 of these frameworks and only one of them was the commercial determinants of health reflected in a conceptual diagram. So our concepts of the drivers of public health fail to include the commercial drivers, and when we communicate to others, using these conceptual diagrams and so on, we forget to mention, I suppose it's what Michael Marmot would call the causes of the causes, or the causes of the causes of the causes. These harms don't just emerge; they come from companies, they come from brands, they come from the CEO's decisions about those brands, and I think they often get lost to view. I'll finish there. Thanks very much.